Thank you very much, Sevkan. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate you using your valuable time to come in and let's talk about communication. So thank you very much for being here. Um, Now, communication is a huge subject, and it's part of everyday life, isn't it? We all communicate in work, in home, relationships, family. It's all around us. It is an important subject, but do we always get it right? Do we, when we send a message, do people understand it? When they send a message to us, do we understand it, or is there a lot of confusion? So what we're going to look at is what can happen during the journey of a message and what causes confusion. So there's various aspects we're going to look at. I'm going to talk about some challenges with communication that I've faced myself, I've experienced, and maybe you can relate to something like that. And then we're going to look at project management and communication on that. And then at the end, as you see there, I'm going to touch a little bit on AI and data. But before I talk about the agenda, I just want to give a little story about some what I think is miscommunication. Something that happened to me last Friday, which you might think is quite funny now. It does funny when I reflect back on it. But I live on the top floor of an apartment block, and therefore I use a lift to get to my apartment. So I was in the lift and the lift got stuck. It made a bang and it just stuck, it shook. So I thought, okay, what do you normally do in these circumstances? You press the yellow button on the lift and then you should hear some alarm sound. Of course, I did that, nothing happened. And then I saw another yellow button a bit further to the right. And I thought, okay, let me press that one. And then I was expecting somebody to talk to me, but there was nobody there. So it was not a nice situation to be in. So I thought, okay, what do I do now? I know I'll press 0 and see if I'll go back down again. And luckily for me, the lift did go back down and I was able to get out of the lift. And I was so relieved that I could do that. So I pressed the yellow buttons thinking that's what you normally do. That's what's communicated to you if you get stuck in a lift. And I phoned the lift company and I said, well, I pressed the button, but nobody answered. They said, well, you should have pressed the button for 10 seconds. I had no idea I had to do that. Nowhere did I see a message that said you had to press it for 10 seconds. So that was to me miscommunication, or maybe I interpreted things wrong. I don't know. Maybe some of you have been stuck in a lift and you might know that, and I had no idea. But I'm going to show you a visual related to that. And it's about misunderstanding, miscommunication. That's why I wanted to sort of mention that. I do have some other stories about communication to share with you. So, what are we going to talk about today? Communication, as I said, is a big subject. So, the kind of things I want to cover. You see in the middle, that's communication. And what I want to first of all talk about is models of communication, a little bit of theory behind communication. What is it about? What happens, sort of thing. So, I think it's good to get a bit of an idea of the theory behind communication. Then I'm going to talk about some challenging situations I've had regarding communication. And, maybe you might be familiar with some of those as well. And then how do we communicate? Is it always by email? Do we always send emails? That's the easy thing to do. But what about the other methods? And then the terminology that we use, the language that we use, what we actually put in our communication, we need to think about that as well. So thought is needed into who we communicate, how we communicate, and what we communicate. And that's why I thought it's important to think about the audience. So I've got audience here. Who are we communicating to? And specifically, what are their needs? So different audiences have different needs. So we need to think about that because it's not necessarily one size fits all. So we have to consider people's needs as well. So there is a lot of thought needed behind passing a message on to somebody in the right way so it gets the right communication. And then projects, as I mentioned, how do we manage communication on projects? And then finishing off with AI and data. Sorry, my eye is watering. I'm not crying. It's just got a watery eye. Sorry. Okay, there you go. Now my opening line on my starter slide was, Didn't you read the email?" Now, can you imagine if you missed some important communication? Maybe you got hundreds of emails and you missed an important piece of communication. And that's not a nice feeling, is it? To think, "Oh, I missed something. I should have picked up on that." And you feel like, you don't know something that you should have known. And that's quite common. And what I actually wanted to write was, "Didn't you read the memo?" Now, maybe some of you know what a memo is, maybe some of you remember, um, but there is this line called "Didn't you get the memo" in a film called Batman Returns. I don't know if anybody knows that, but it's all about the idea behind saying "Didn't you get the memo" is that somebody missed some important communication. So everybody else knew, but they didn't. So we all know that's not a good position to be in, to not get the information. So that's why it's important to manage communication. All right, so that's the agenda. And just to say, at the end, we'll look at some key takeaways, and then you have opportunity to ask questions. You can put comments in the chat as well. Please feel free to do that. So we'll have a Q&A session towards the end. So a little bit about myself. Now, some of you may already know me. Maybe I've trained some of you, but very, very briefly, my background. I've had quite a varied career in different industries. So on the left-hand side, we can see that I've got fashion, manufacturing, and retail. So I started off as a designer, working for various manufacturing companies. Learned about quality control, product development, and all that kind of thing, and then worked for two different manufacturers of computer-aided design and manufacturing systems for those industries, where I trained a lot of operators. And then my first actual project manager role was for a company called Torix Retail, where I was involved in installing point of sale systems. So when you go to a shop and they scan something, the system they use is that electronic point of sale system that links back to head office. And then in the middle, you've got at the top Mace, which is a construction company. So I set up a project support office based at the customer site there. So that was a good introduction to what do project managers need, how do we work on the customer site, and that kind of thing. And then the last three logos are all about the three universities that I've worked for. The one in the middle, the orange logo, is the university in the Netherlands. So I lived there for 11 years, developing courses in project management, delivering courses in management as well. Because of my background in managing projects, I was lucky to be involved in managing quite a few of their projects, which I really enjoyed. So aside from teaching, I managed quite a few of the projects for the university. One that was really special to me was this one called Green Bubbles. So you see the logo at the top. Um, why that was special was because it was an EU-funded project that I kind of brought to the university by a colleague, a contact, a friend actually, that was a marine biologist. So this project was about marine protected areas, and our case study location was in Italy. It was a good grounding to work on a project with an international partners. There were about nine different organizations, including us, and we worked together and spent time in Italy, and it was all about communicating with different organizations, with different disciplines like scientists, researchers, tourism experts, and so on. Our university was representing the media and entertainment department, so lots of disciplines coming together on a large project. And then 4 years ago, I moved back to the UK and worked for the University of Bradford on a project and the University of Leeds on a project that was actually in partnership with the Alan Turing Institute. And for me, that was the first sort of real recognition about how important data is for a project. I worked with lots of data scientists, and that was a good kind of introduction to me about the value of data. But now what I do is I teach project management to various organizations, and you see the certifications there. That's what I teach, and I also have some other certifications as well. So that's about me. But let's look at the agenda item that I wanted to talk about first, which is models, communication models specifically. There are loads of, there are so many communication models. But what I've done is just picked out a couple just to explain the theory behind communication, because I think it's important to recognize that what happens to communication and why it happens and so on. So the first model, I've simplified it, and basically what it's saying is that someone who's a sender prepares a message. Yeah, so they're sending a message. That message is to be sent to people who are the receivers, and what they will do is receive and interpret the message. Sounds straightforward, but in the middle, you could have something called noise. There could be some interruptions. It could be something that interferes along the way, interferes with the message, and therefore it's not interpreted. Some examples could be, there's just the terminology is not understood, the language, the formality maybe there's not enough knowledge by the receivers about the subject, for instance. There could be a number of things that could cause interference, and the person at the receiving end doesn't get the message properly. I'll show you some examples, and I'm sure you can think of quite a few as well. But that's the noise factor we have to look out for. The other theory that I want to show you is similar. You still have somebody who's sending the information, the source of the information, but we may need to consider things like their communication skills, their knowledge, their attitude. These are factors that affect the message that's actually being created. And that message goes through some kind of channel and again goes to the receivers. So again, we have to think about the knowledge of the receivers. Do they have the knowledge of what the source is sending? What about the culture of the organization, the culture of wherever they are? There could be differences from the receiver and the source. So again, this shows that there could be some distortion of the message getting through to the end. So our message has a journey. And remember, we're talking about two-way communication. So there should be a way of asking questions and feeding back if that's what's also needed. So talking about messages being distorted, I want to show you this example, and maybe some of you have seen this. It's called Chinese whispers. It could be a game that children play, for example, where they say something to somebody and that gets interpreted and then passed on to the next person and the next person and the next person and so on. And at the end of the day, is the same message received at the end, or has it got, did we introduce noise? Did it get interrupted along the way? Maybe some of you have played Chinese whispers and you think, that has happened. Yeah. Now, this actually happened in a real situation way back. Let me just show you. Way back in 1914, when messages had to be relayed via radio, there was a military message that was sent from one radio operator to another, and so on. I don't know exactly how many radio operators, but the original message was, send reinforcements, we are going to advance, right? To me, that sounds quite a serious message, sent by the military. But after so many sort of iterations of that message going through, I wonder if anybody knows what the final message was. It wasn't that. It was actually, send 3 and 4pence, we are going to a dance. I mean, crikey, what a difference in the original message to the next message. Yeah. So, this is also noise, interruption, interpretation of the message, communication. Things can go wrong. Yeah. So this is quite a well-known one. I think there's slightly different versions of it as well, but this is, what can happen. I'm going to talk about a couple of challenges I had with communication. As I mentioned, I've experienced these mainly when I was training operators. So I mentioned that I worked for a number of CAD/CAM system suppliers, and we were selling these systems to manufacturers of clothing, for example, in various countries. So I spent quite a bit of time in Romania, Poland, and Hungary teaching the operators on how to use these systems. But of course, all my delivery was done in English, translated by somebody at the organization, so the operators could use it. And then if they had any questions, that would come back. So the whole process took time. There was a time for me to explain, time to translate, interpret, and then back again, get that feedback. So I had to be very careful in my choice of words, to be clear, precise, because everything had to be translated. And I think what helped me was watching the people's facial expressions. If I was teaching the operators how to use a system, if I watched their faces, I could see, I think you have a question coming up. I think what your question might be. So I would think, what might they want to ask? Do they understand? No, they look a bit confused. So it was very much working closely. So the visual aspect was very important. That focus on, do people understand it? And are they doing what they should be doing on the system? So it was a slow process, but it did work, but it did require patience, both on my side and the operator side. And we did have a funny moment, actually, which I'm going to share with you just now. I'm going to find my mouse, one second. So we were using a computer system, and at one point I said, okay, now close the window. And the lady that was translating for me looked very confused and started looking at the room and the windows, thinking, why does Bina want that window to be closed? What's that got to do with it? It was a kind of a confusing situation, but we chuckled at the end of it. But you see, that's how things can be misinterpreted. The different languages, the different terminology, the different knowledge, and so on. And then one final one about the working in different countries and different languages. At one point, I had to teach a system where all the menu functions were in German, and I didn't know German, so I had to do my own little translation. Delivered the training to a company in Hungary. So there was, difficulty on my part because I had to make sure I knew what that function meant. Difficulty on the operators because they had to also sort of understand what that meant as well. But again, what helped was the visual, watching the operators use the system, seeing if they're doing things in the right order, and anticipating what kind of questions they might ask. So having that awareness, being more active as a trainer was important because I had to interpret what was going on. And at the end of the day, they needed to be able to learn the system because they had to do business as usual. They had to get the work done really. So that was a challenge, and maybe some of you have experienced that before. Yeah. Okay. Actually, the good thing about the system was it was all about manipulating shapes on the screen. So that again helped the visual aspect of what the functions were. So if they weren't able to manipulate the shape, I knew that they were lost somewhere in the functionality. All right. So those are some of the challenges. I'm going to talk a bit more about terminology actually, and I'm going to talk about idioms. A strange word, but I suspect most of you know lots of idioms. What is an idiom? So let me bring up three examples of idioms. And I don't know where they originated, how they originated. You know, for instance, what does raining cats and dogs mean, and why do they say that? Why do they say it's raining cats and dogs? Imagine I was in Romania and it was raining so hard, and I said, "Oh, it's raining cats and dogs." I don't think anybody would know what on earth I was talking about. Where does that come from? So this is like, if you like, local or particular to that country way of communicating things. And I'm sure you all know lots of other idioms. Like use your loaf, get your ducks in a row. It's a strange kind of language, isn't it? That not everybody is going to understand. But we use it, don't we? We say that. We say these things because we assume everybody understands them. Yeah. So there is that assumption. Now, I mentioned I lived in the Netherlands, and there was an assumption there that I understood all the idioms that were used in the Netherlands, and I didn't because I'd never heard them before. So, for example, there was one um, which is about peanut butter, funnily enough. Hellas pindakaas. So if I said to my friend, my bicycle has got a flat tire, and it's like, oh dear, that's a shame. They would say Hellas pindakaas, which actually means that's too bad. So I learned that was common to say that, which I don't know how it originated, but I think it's quite funny anyway. So I got to know that idiom and a few others as well. The last idiom I'm going to talk about, which some of you may be familiar with, is actually one that my mum used to use a lot. And in the language of Gujarati, which is the language I can speak, I can't write it, but it goes, and I'll just say it one time. It says "Gadelane tawawe," which really means it's enough to make a donkey sick. So if I did something silly or there was something silly going on, she would say it was enough to make a donkey sick. So poor donkey, you know. I don't know how that came about, but reason I'm mentioning these is we can't assume everybody understands everything we're saying, depends on the culture, the language, the background, and so on. So some of these things we would understand, but not everybody would understand. So I thought I'd just add those because I think idioms are quite funny, actually, personally. I know people are putting a few messages in the. Let me just have a look. Louise, in the very old days when people had straw roofs, the cats and dogs would sleep on the roof for warmth and arose from inside. When it rained heavily, the straw would give way. Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I had no idea. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Loaf of bread equals head, so use your head. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? There's a lot of stories behind these idioms. Okay, one more bit of humor actually, because I think it's nice to do that. Actually, I don't know why my eyes are watering. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Right. Okay. What do you see on the screen? Do you see 4 candles or do you see a handle for a fork? Yeah. Where am I going with this? I wonder if anybody knows about this. Where is this coming from? It's from an old sketch. Let me just show you. It's from an old sketch from the two Ronnies. Yeah, thank you, Kelper. Definitely, the two Ronnies, way back in 1976, where a chap goes into a hardware shop and asks for 4 candles. And the guy gives him, a packet of candles, 4 in the box. And he keeps saying, no, 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 4 candles, 4 candles. What he really wanted was handles for forks. So again, it's about that. How is that message sent? How is it interpreted? The noise, it all sounds the same. So I think it's quite funny how we can misinterpret things very, very easily because we didn't hear it or we assume um, we just don't get it. So yeah, that's the last funny I'm going to show you for now anyway. All right. Best comedy sketch ever made. Yeah, Louise, it's quite an old one, isn't it? And it's probably some others anyway. I think there was some other ones about going into that shop, but I just picked this one actually because I think it's about miscommunication, isn't it? Really. So let's talk about methods. We'll talk about challenges. Let's talk about methods. Now I'm going to show you some very old methods that maybe a lot of you have never seen before. Telex machine. Maybe some of you have heard of telex machine. What does it look like? Yeah, it looks like kind of a printer, doesn't it? So way back before the internet, before mobile phones, when I was delivering training, say in Poland, for instance, and there was a problem with the machine, and I needed to speak to one of the engineers. How did I get hold of the engineer? I had to get somebody from the office to type a short message that would be sent across, and then the next day, because there's time difference and so on, hopefully I've got get a message. So it's very, very slow. You had to be very precise, short message. And then later on, we advanced a bit more to fax machines. So maybe some of you remember fax machines, they would dial up and then whir and then churn out lots of paper, and you could have pictures as well. So that was a bit of an advancement as well. And very often, if I was staying in a hotel, I'd check to see, oh, have you had a fax for me? I was waiting for a fax from work, for instance. So, yeah, look at that. And then memos in pigeonholes. So I remember one of the projects I was working on, we had to print off the reports and put them in everybody's pigeonhole, and hopefully they would go and check it. So the responsibility was up to them to go and check if they've got any communication or not. And again, when I was staying in a hotel, I'd look at the pigeonhole for my room and say, have you got any messages for me, kind of thing. So it's a bit of a passive way of sending information, isn't it? The person receiving it doesn't really know unless they go past their pigeonhole if they've got any information or not. But nowadays, we've got it so quick, haven't we? We can get things so quickly in whatever format we need. It's so different. I mean, the first phone I had actually was a car phone fixed to a car, which I didn't really use much, So things have come a long way. So now you think communication should be a lot faster, a lot better, a lot more accurate. And maybe it is, but maybe there's still some noise somewhere that can affect it. So I'm going to ask a poll question, which Sevkan's going to set up in a moment, which is this. I'd be interested to know what your preferred format for receiving information is. Yeah. Meanwhile, I'll just dry my eyes. I don't know why they're watering. One second. I'm not crying. Well, okay, interesting feedback. Actually, I'll just wait for the poll to stop, and I can have a quick review. Okay, so we have written stroke text, 22 people, picture, 3 people, phone call, 6 people, video, 7, experience, active involvement, 17. That's really interesting. That written text has gone up to 22. So top is written or text, second is experience or active involvement. Great, that's really good to see. And you may have picked more than one anyway, but we all have our preferences on what suits us when it comes to receiving information. I personally really like pictures, because being a visual learner, that to me is helpful, but also experience and active involvement and video. It depends what we're doing as well. So that's great. Thank you very much for that feedback. That's good to see. I'm going to close the poll just now. Thank you. Thanks, Sevcam. All right, so that leads us nicely on to methods of communication, because that's what I was trying to find out. How do you prefer to receive communication? And I thought it'd be good to look at a theory, which is actually about learning styles. It's from Fleming and Mills. But even, we're not talking about learning, we're talking about receiving communication. But even if you receive a message, you receive a report or something like that, you're still absorbing that information. You're still learning in some way, aren't you? So I think it's relevant. And what the theory suggests is that you use VARC, which stands for visual, auditory, reading stroke writing, or kinesthetic. And of course, you can use a multiple approach of these. So this is a way of conveying the information. You can use these different ways. Yeah. So let's look at some examples of these. We'll start off by looking at visual. And I know that's something some of you said you do prefer. And now you've probably all heard that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Yeah. And for me, that is really helpful. If I'm, for example, when I'm training and I'm trying to describe a theory, then we'll draw a picture and the delegates remember that. So pictures, as it says here, visuals can aid learning and memory retention. So you remember that by remembering the visual, for instance. Also, if you see graphs and things like that, trends, by looking at the image, you can see a trend that's easier to see than maybe reading a report, for instance. So visuals do reveal a lot of things. And actually, I listened to a webinar not so long ago about neuroscience, run by Melanie and Tibisay, as you see here. And they were saying that a visual uses less brain processing power. So I think that's great, because if we get some information, we don't want to have to work too hard at it. We want to grasp the message quickly. And maybe a visual, providing it's the right visual, and clear and there's no noise, that should be a good way of getting the information. So I like the sound of it using less brain processing power. Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm just looking at the chat. Depends on what. Yeah, it does depend. Some things might be, you might need a combination of things actually, and that's why you've got to use the appropriate method. Um, yeah. So it depends what's relevant. Not everybody, like in the survey we just did, the poll, some of you preferred the active involvement or reading. So it could be a personal preference. So my personal preference, for me, is a visual. But I also like to read things as well. Depends on what it is that I'm looking at. Quick slide really about my complaint about the visual and my misunderstanding of the lift situation. there's the button that I pressed when I first got stuck in the lift. And then I realized, oh, there's another yellow button here. I didn't know that. Okay, let me press that one with a little face. And I was expecting somebody to talk to me, but nobody talked to me. Anyway, then now I've been in this lift many, many times. I never ever noticed, but you see up here, there is this little symbol, and in small writing, it says 20 seconds. So I'm supposed to press this button for 20 seconds. I would not have known that, would not have picked that up. I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that sticker is in the wrong place. It should be somewhere here or even in yellow. Yeah. So you can put visuals, but if they're not obvious, you know, not going to get it. So now when I go in the lift, I'm always going to look for something like this. Um, which also reminds me, you can put visuals there, but how many times have you seen people trying to pull a door when it says push on the door? I've done it myself. So we can recognize it, but there's sometimes a disconnect between the information, the communication, and what we do. Yeah. All right. Let's have a look at some more visuals, right? IKEA furniture. Who's been involved with building furniture? I guess we all have at some point or other. Not my favorite task, and luckily I don't do it that much, but if we have a picture that shows us what screws should we use, what other gadgets, tools should we use, where do they go, that makes it so much easier, yeah, than trying to read about it. So that's really helpful. So that's another visual way of communicating. Another way is actually, well, combining visual and auditory, a video. I think this is a really good idea. And I often watch videos if there's something technical, I think, how do I do this? How do I don't know, empty my dishwasher of whatever it is, or how do I put salt in? I don't know where the user manual is. Let me find a video. Maybe we've all been there, but this is visual and auditory. So you watch, you listen. That's a great way of getting the information. You can scroll back, pause it, and so on. So you're in control of absorbing that information. Yeah, providing you find the right video and that kind of thing. So we're going through the VARC model. We've been talking about visual, we're talking about auditory, another auditory one here. Audiobooks, favorite of mine actually. Maybe some of you like audiobooks. So remember, this is also about how you absorb information. So auditory, for me, I like that because I can listen to an audiobook or a podcast when I'm tidying up or whatever. However, I have to admit that if it's a non-fiction book, for example, or even mainly non-fiction is what I look at. I do like to have a hard copy of the book because then I feel like I can control the pace of it. I can stop when I want to. I want to go back and read. I can make notes. I can highlight. So again, it's about personal preferences and combining what works for you. Yeah. So maybe if you need to send a message to somebody, you'll record a voice message which they can listen to again. You might even follow up with an email or a text message or something. So there are different options. I'm not saying just use one, but think what would work best and what would that person like, and what do you like? What's your preference as well? Yeah. So with the bark, then we've learned about visual, auditory. Then we've got reading and writing. Sorry, my mouse has disappeared. There we go. Reading and writing. Maybe you prefer to make your own notes. You get some information, and you might think, okay, I'm going to digest this and make my own notes to understand it better. That's entirely up to you. These are different ways of absorbing information. So some of you in the poll did say that you preferred reading, and like I said with the book, it gives me time to slow down and read it as I want to, kind of thing. And then the K from VARC is for kinesthetic, which is all about the senses. It's about touching, feeling, hearing, smelling, tasting, all those kind of things. Of course, what's appropriate at that time. So what we see in the picture here, we see a lady wearing a VR headset, virtual reality headset, and maybe some of you had a go at this. And this is from a company called PMC, and their VR headset is to do with projects and experiences and so on. But it's that immersive experience. If you want to communicate something to somebody, let them feel it, let them see what it feels like, let them explore it. And that's kind of kinesthetic experience. Um, and if I just refer back to the Green Bubbles project that I mentioned, which was about protecting marine protected areas, recognizing their value and so on, um, my team developed a VR headset, which is a virtual experience of what it's like to be underwater that anybody could use. They kind of a little move around as if they're in the underwater. They see marine life, they see the damage that it can cause. But that was a great way to get the message across to people to understand why it was important to protect that area. Yeah, so they felt they were immersed in it. So that's a very up and coming way of experiencing. And I think quite a few of you said that you would prefer the experience of learning, of getting information. And maybe in your teams, you use post-it notes. You physically, it's tactile. You're doing something. You're working together as a team. So that's more engaging kind of experience, I think. So that's VARC that we've just learned about. Now, I'm going to take VARC a little bit further and talk about audiences and needs. So here, I've put audience and needs and VARC, but put two new words in actually. Neurodiversity. It's very prominent these days. Neuroscience, neurodiversity. You see a lot about it on LinkedIn, for example. What it's about is that we need to ensure that whatever communication we use is suitable for the different ways of thinking, the different experiences, the different styles of communication that people prefer, because we're all wired differently, so we have to take into account diversity and inclusion. So I picked dyslexia as an example to say, well, what if we have to communicate to an audience that has dyslexia, for example? What do we need to think about? So I just picked up a few things, for example, and using VARC, for instance, that, visuals, things like flowcharts and graphics are much more meaningful and more helpful in this circumstance. Listening is quite helpful. Um, if they were going to read something, then we have to think about the size of the font, the line spacing, the background, and that's why I made my background. Sorry, it says background a couple of times. I made it cream because that's more easier than a plain white background, for instance. Yeah, writing. Yeah, give the ability to use a computer, for example, and then kinesthetic as well. That's using the senses is going to be more meaningful and probably easier to absorb the information. To interpret it. If, for example, we're catering, we're tailoring our communication for neurodiversity, and the example I've given is dyslexia. Yeah. So maybe you can think of other examples as well, but it's just to say, look, it's not one size fits all. It's not just let's send an email to everybody. We have to really think about who is our audience, what are their needs, what can we do to make sure that everybody gets the information that they should. Yeah. And that they can feed back as well. So we have to think of the audience. If anybody wants to add any more comments or things in the chat, please feel free to do so. We'll have a look at them at the end of the session, but it's nice to. I'm open to your comments and suggestions, definitely. Okay, just try to get my mouse back in the place. So think of your audience, and that's why I'm just going to leave that there for a second. Think of the audience, yeah. I quite like this image actually. You've got a seagull who's completely ignoring the sign that says no seagulls at all. So yeah, you still have to think of your audience. Okay, so that's the challenges, the methods, the terminology, and what we're going to look at now is the project management side of it. How do we manage communication on projects? Now, you probably have heard or read that poor communication is a real factor that stops projects from being successful. Yeah, it's a shame, really, because communication is what people do. If we fall down on that and we develop great products and all that kind of thing, communication could let us down. So I'm going to pick up a couple of the the approaches that I teach, for example. So PRINCE2 Agile, of course, focuses on communication, but it calls it rich communication. To me, it's rich, it's got value, it's going to be effective. So it's all about being effective. Yes, we've got good communication, but is it effective? Is it working properly? Is it doing the job? Do people understand it? And so on. So we have to have effective communication and we have to plan for it. So as it says there, if we're working in an agile way, it's not just going to happen. We can't just assume that everything's going to be right. We have to plan for it. We have to make it happen. Also have to have a behavior of rich communication. So what we also see from PRINCE2 Agile is that we need to have a communication management approach. You know, but think about that. It's like, who are our stakeholders? Who do we need to communicate to? What? It's a who, the what, the when, the how, the why, and all that kind of thing. Clarify that on our approach. So if we're setting out a project, we're thinking up front how we're going to communicate and manage that throughout the project. And communication can also be, well, workshops. Don't think of it as always documents. Run workshops, face-to-face communication, use the appropriate channel. What's right? That's what you've got to think about. And important point there, communication is the oxygen a project needs to survive, which makes it sound so essential that if we don't have good communication everywhere, things are going to go wrong, aren't they, really? So it becomes a responsibility and a behavior for everybody to make sure that communication is not forgotten, really. Moving on to another approach, which is PRINCE2, and I'm now specifically referring to version 7, which I think it's great that they put in a new chapter about people. Projects are about people. People communicate with each other. So, and it's also emphasizing that it's not just a case of here's a message, I've sent it out, but we need to be listening as well. What are people saying? What questions that they're asking? So it's that two-way thing. It's not just a case of send the email and forget about it, but we have to listen as well. And just very briefly, the two circles at the bottom represent people in the organization. You've got people on your project, you've got people in the organization. They have their own groups and their own kind of communication channels, but we need to make sure all the stakeholders that need to know that we've got relationships built, so we can work together and then we can communicate as well. So very much focused on the people side of things, and I think that's a really good addition, because nothing will happen without people, really, will it? So we need to be aware of that. And the final method I'm going to talk about very briefly is agile project management. Excuse me. I think I've got a frog in my throat. 1 second, I'm going to have a quick sip of water. I don't know how it got there, and I don't know why they call it frog in the throat, but anyway. All right. So I picked up a couple of things from AgilePM, and one is a principle which says communicate continuously and clearly. Now that might sound obvious. Yes, of course you've got to communicate, but it's that consistency and continuously. We might be really good at the start of the project and be very meticulous and send all the information, but that could peter out. We forget, and then it fizzles out, and then nobody knows what's going on. So there's that continuous and clearly. It's a principle. It should run through the whole project. The other item I picked out is one of the statements from the Agile Manifesto, which really says, okay, you can have brilliant processes, you can have great tools and things like that, but if your people don't interact with each other, if they haven't got the skills, say the soft skills, communication skills, and so on, then you're going to lose something. So having the way people interact and communicate will add more value to your project than having a brilliant tool, for instance. So, continuing with the theme of communication within a project, if we think about teams working together, yeah, they want to have team communication. So, a way of getting their progress very quickly is by having something called a daily stand up or a daily scrum if they're using Scrum. And basically, they have a meeting the same time every day. So let's say 9:30 every morning. Each person has 2 minutes to say these things. What have I done since the last stand up meeting? What am I going to do next? So reflecting back, forecasting forward, and what problems am I having? So if they do that, that's a very, very quick way for the team to communicate their progress to themselves and know where the problems are and so on. It's not written documentation, it's that quick, straight to the point. Let's just find out where we are. So that's a kind of a ritual, if you like, that a team can have. So maybe some of you are using Scrum, or the SDM Agile PM. You think, yeah, we have stand-ups, we have this. So it's very focused and great for the team. It's their communication. So about progress, then, you might say, okay, I'm going to write a progress report because people like reading and writing, and I might say, okay, at the end of day one, this is what happened. At the end of day two, we hit a problem. So reading that, I think, oh, okay, I think I know what's going on. But wouldn't it be nicer if you just got a diagram like this? This is a what we call a burn down chart. Yeah. And I put a happy face to say, look, things are going really well. And a sad face to say, look, hit a problem there. Because that was that was our planned. And actually, we were there. We hadn't done as much work as we can. So very quickly, remember I was talking about um, there's less brain processing power needed when you look at a diagram like this. You can very quickly get the information that you need. So visualize things as much as you can. People are more likely to pick it up, understand it, look at it because it's easy. People want to have easy information, the process being easy and simplified as well. Other visuals that are used also in agile project management, for example, they're known as information radiator, big visible chart, use a traffic light system. Maybe you've heard of some of these, and maybe you're using some kind of tools like Jira, for instance, where you can get get information like this. Again, it's about making it clear, easy to see, and that way people are more likely to look at it. So you might need to be creative with how you display your information, color coding it. Some people call it the rag status. That again, very quickly you can capture the information. So we're reducing the noise. If we're color coding, we're reducing the noise. We're making it easier for the person interpreting that message to understand it. So there's no confusion. We're trying to, reduce the confusion. And the another tool that the Agile team can use is something called a Kanban board. I won't go into too much detail about it. There's a lot more behind Kanban than the board itself. But very quickly, if I was to look at that, I could see that, okay, two things are being deployed. They're working on three things at the moment. Two things haven't been started yet. So it's a very, very quick way of looking at progress. I personally use a Kanban board myself. To manage my to-do list, and it's great because very quickly I can see, okay, oh, this is in progress. I finished now, so I can move it along to the end, for instance. So it's again visual, very quick access to information makes it easier. All right, I'm going to ask you another poll question, the last poll question coming up actually, which you'll see on the screen in a moment. It's if you're working on projects, which of the following do you do? Okay, good to see. The highest percentage, I know the numbers are changing, but the highest percentage seems to be that a lot of you have weekly or monthly progress meetings. Yeah, so you get together with your senior management and you talk about the progress on the project so far every month, every week. So that's kind of a time-driven thing. Every Friday we meet, then we meet next Friday, and so on. So the majority of people are having that. Some people are sending regular progress reports to management, and a slightly smaller number are enabling management to access project progress information when they want. Yeah. So that's quite interesting, actually, that there are people who are sharing the information when so people can access it when they want. So I assume then that you're probably using some kind of tool that let's say the other stakeholders can access. Great. So I'm going to close that poll. Thank you for that. That's good to see. So talking about sharing information, if you're sending a report, you're pushing the information. The stakeholders, they're waiting for you to deliver the information to them. So you're in control, really. You have to make sure it's all ready so that you can push it to the people that need it. If you're making the information available, then you're allowing your stakeholders to pull the information as and when they need it. So you have to make sure it's up to date, the right people have got access to it, to what they need, and the responsibility becomes theirs to get the information. A quick example I thought about really was, before we had the internet and you wanted to know what your bank balance was, you probably had to wait for a letter to arrive in the post. Well, now you can just log in, into your account securely and so on, and you can access that information wherever you want. So you've got more control. So that's the difference between pulling and pushing information. Um, I, th- I think well, I like to pull information because I like to see it when I need to. But you have to make sure it's up to date, and you have to think about uh, data security and all that kind of thing as well. Okay. All right. So just a quick summary slide of when you're getting information together, who's the audience? Why do they need it? Not everybody needs everything. What level of information do they need? Because if they get too much, they're not going to find the thing of interest to them. So think about who needs it. Do they need to do something about it? Do they need to give you some feedback or so on? You know, and timing as well. Yeah. So these are just some of the factors to consider. And of course, what do you actually send them? A picture, some text, and that kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the last section, really, which is about AI and data. Now, I did say I'm not an expert in AI and data, but I am learning about it because I think I should do. It's here to stay. It's already here. It's been here since 1950s, really, and we are already using it. It's going to affect every single industry and every profession. And maybe you've heard some of these terms: generative AI, natural language processing. Well, this is a lot. I'm not going to give you a lecture or anything on AI. I'm just saying you may have heard of some of these things, but I'm going to tell you about somebody who does know a lot more about AI than I certainly do. And he wrote this book called AI and the Project Manager way back in 2022. His name is Peter Taylor. Maybe some of you know him. You may have heard of him. He's a guru in the project management world. He's a keynote speaker. And I came across Peter about 4 years ago when I moved back to the UK, and I got to know him. I've never met him. I got to know him, and I was lucky because he became my mentor for a while when I moved back to the UK, so I could sort of pick up on my career again. And he was very, very helpful. And I was lucky that I got to contribute a little bit, a paragraph to this book and one of his other books. He's written so many books. But what he's pointing out really is that we can't go around with our eyes shut because project management is going to be disrupted. In fact, it already is being disrupted, and that at some point, these things like reports that we've been talking about, that sort of process is going to be fully automated. So AI could be delivering the right information to the right people at the right time and hopefully in the right way, and also take into account people's preferences and neurodiversity. Yeah, that's the human side. We want AI to understand, really. The other thing Peter says about data is, okay, data is important, but it's got to be right. Garbage in equals garbage out. So your data needs to be accurate, clean, and all that kind of thing. And as project leaders, we need to understand data more. We need to sort of be a bit more literate on project on project data. So yeah, look up Peter Taylor. He's written some really, really good books, and I think writing this like 2 years ago was a very good move he made, actually. I'm going to skip this one because I think I'll just go. I'm just keeping an eye on the time as well. I'll go on to the next one. This is just you'll find a lot of information on what people are thinking about AI online on LinkedIn. But I'm just going to just show you the Prince2 book again, version 7, which, as you can see, I'm a fan of now. They've included something new, which I think again is a brilliant inclusion. And they've included the fact that you need a digital and data management approach. So on your projects, think about what technology you're going to use, what data are you going to use, how is it going to be created. So when you're starting your project, you're getting organized and that kind of thing. Think about this, build that into your project because you want to be able to manage communication, you want to be able to use data, and you want to be able to use the tools that will help you with that process. Okay, so let's just have a quick visit of the agenda again, the kind of things I've gone through, maybe quite quickly on some of the things, but just to remind you, communication, we looked at models and noise and how that could interrupt the message and the channels and whatever we're doing to make the recipient not interpret the message properly. So we have to try and reduce that noise. Talking about terminology, formality, also the culture. I put here culture of the organization. What language do we normally use? The formality and the terminology and sort of thing. We have to be aware of that. Projects a communication management approach. Needs, we talked about VARC and neurodivergence, and then finally automation for AI and data. So those are the key takeaways. Which leaves me with one more slide, which I'm going to go on to, and then I'll pass you over to Serjan, which is really to say thank you very much for joining. So we have a cat says that they're saying thank you in many different languages, and we have a dog there with lots of words, new terminology that we've used. And I guess if it's stop raining cats and dogs, then they're all on their way home. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's the end of my my slides. Sefkan, over to you now.
Thank you so much, Bina. Really enjoyed that presentation, and I hope everyone did as well. If you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat. I'm going to share a survey. So while we wait for people to have some questions, can you please fill out the survey? It's very short, and it would actually help us a lot in our future webinars. So does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, please feel free to ask your questions. Just looking at Mahogany Jones. Oh no, what do you say? In the USA, we call that the telephone tree. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure which bit you're referring to, but you've got, so you're familiar with. Yeah. Okay. I think you were referring to an idiom. I think somebody asked about the survey, the results of a survey. Let me just find that question.
Oh, probably missed that out.
I think it was something that I was referring to in the slides, and I think you wanted to know where did the information come from. I think just trying to find that question. It's a shame some people had some connection issues, and I think you had to sort of log out and log back in again. So that's a shame, but hopefully you'll get access. They'll be able to get access to the recording, won't they?
Yep.
Yeah.
I know Rachel couldn't join, so I already emailed her actually. So if she does have any questions, I will forward it over to you.
Yeah. Yep. And it's great that Louise, you told me where the raining cats and dogs comes in. I thought of another one, barking up the wrong tree. I mean, there's quite a lot about dogs, isn't there, really? What else have we got?
So just a quick reminder for everyone, the webinar is recorded. You will receive it most probably beginning of next week. You would also receive the slides. So I think that answers, can we get the slides?
Louise, you ask a good question. Any tips on measuring or assessing how effective communication has been on a project? I think you've just got to, you could do a test to see, well, okay, we've sent a message. How many people have responded to it? Why have some people not responded to it? If they have responded, did they get the message? I think it'd be good to do a test because there could be so much communication going on. So you might think, well, is it because we're sending it in the wrong, the structure's wrong, the format is wrong, maybe, or maybe you could ask and say, okay, what do people prefer? People not reading messages because they prefer a conversation, for example. What are the preferences? So it'd be good to understand the stakeholders' requirements, I think, to get to get people to look on a project. I don't know if you think that's a reasonable thing to suggest, Louise. Please feel free to, or if anybody else has any questions, sorry, any suggestions. He's talking about how effective communication has been on a project. It could depend on the message, that the particular message. Some messages might be more effective in that people got them. Some might not, where they're too complicated. There's different factors, I think, that affect it, really. Yeah, is that okay, Louise? Thank you. If anybody else has got any suggestions, or you've done something yourself and think, oh, we did a survey. The question is how to convey the message to the management that projects take much longer than their expectation when they don't want to know the details of PM approach we are using. Yeah, that's a difficult one, because when you said they don't want to know the details of the PM approach you're using, so if you're using Agile or something else, maybe they're not interested in that, which is a shame, because, and I don't know if you are using Agile, for instance, but let's say you're using Agile and you're as a PM, you want to do all the things that Agile suggests, but your organization also has to adopt that Agile mindset to support the project. There has to be that understanding that, you're doing things this way, and they have to also buy in. So I think that is difficult when you say they don't want to know the details of the PM approach we are using. Okay, they might not be interested in the approach, but what information is important to them? Are they involved in checking that the business case is still valid? Are they involved in the requirements, defining the requirements for the project? So it's also about the responsibility that they have. So I think it's quite a big broad question you're asking. Agile, yeah, okay. That's fine, as long as you've got a method that works. It could be a combination of things, but also what is the responsibility of the organization? And you said that they think it takes longer. Well, what is taking the long time? Is it because they're not responding? Is it because you're waiting for decisions from them? Is it that they're trying to make something that's too perfect? They want too many requirements. They're not prioritizing. It could be a number of factors, really, behind why they think it's taken too long, to be honest. I think it's not a simple answer. You'd have to sort of really investigate why they don't want to know and what is actually taking long. Good question, though. Thank you for that. I don't know if there are any other questions at the moment.
We've just received another one right at the bottom.
How to deal with conflicting messages on a project. The PM is telling us one thing and some managers are telling us something else. Well, the PM is telling us one thing. So I take it you're in a team and you're getting information from the project manager, yeah? But then he says some managers. So who are these other managers? And why are they communicating to you if your direct contact is a project manager? It's like you're getting conflicting pieces of information. One from the PM, who I assume is the one that's sort of giving you the work, but who are these other managers and why are they involved? I don't know what their role is and why they're involved. are these senior managers telling the team managers what to do? When really should it be the project manager that's sort of the link between, if you're a team manager, the team, and senior management. So it sounds like there's a bit of yeah. I think it sounds like probably need to revisit the team structure and the roles and responsibilities, and say, what is the role and the responsibility of the senior management? What's the responsibility of the project manager, so they know where their boundaries are. You don't want to be micromanaged. You want to be able to get on with the work. So it sounds like senior management are kind of bypassing the project manager in this case, or not letting the project manager handle the teams, if you like. Yeah. I think it's about defining roles and responsibilities. Who's involved? What is their responsibility? Who should be? You can have people outside of the project, who are interested in the project, but who is actually running the project? Who's got that say? That's something that needs to be. I would look at the team structure and see which are the roles and responsibilities. Draw pictures, show people that this is a team structure, and define the roles and responsibilities. I don't know if that's possible to do, but it sounds like it's needed, because you've got you've got communication coming from too many different sources. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Does anyone have any more questions?
I think that was the last one, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well,
So
thank you for the questions. Sorry, I just want to say thank you for the questions and the comments. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. Just another reminder, the webinar recording and the slides will be out next week. So you are free to leave. Thank you so much for the survey. Just finished the poll. So thank you very much everyone, and hope to see you in our next webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.